Welcome to a new episode of InFocus with Ejaz Haider. After a break, we are back to the triangular conflict between Iran, the US, and the Zionist entity. As always, it's important to flag the point that the US-Zionist duo is the aggressor in this war. But before I get into the discussion with a special guest, a word about this program. It is sponsored by the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. CESPA is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and its menu consists of issues that make up contemporary security and strategic developments. This program is part of that effort. So from the flip of yesterday to the flop of today to now electronic signing of a memorandum of understanding, it's not yet a framework agreement or an agreement. US President Donald Trump has alternated between thundering to destroy Iran to wanting to make a deal and claiming the deal is about to get signed. By the way, it was to be signed Saturday. Then we were told it will be signed Sunday. Now Reuters is reporting that Iran says it won't be tomorrow. So just remember the adage, many a slip betwixt the cup and the lip. So fingers crossed. In fact, someone on X said, and I quote, American credibility has deteriorated to the point where the president can announce a diplomatic agreement and the near universal reaction is, let's wait for confirmation from Tasneem. Tasneem, for viewers who might not be aware, is a semi-official news agency associated with the IRGC. There's a Persian proverb, you can't lift two watermelons with one hand. If this war has proved anything at all, it is that the US has remarkably failed to achieve its strategic objectives. And I'm being charitable because this statement assumes that there indeed were achievable strategic objectives for which the US had an operational strategy. Clausewitz's classic sweat own seal, that itself is in grave doubt. Now, Trump wants out, but he wants out with a win. Those are his two watermelons. But there's a slight problem here. Iran has no reason to give him a win. So he can either choose to pick up the watermelon of getting out or the watermelon of getting a win. The second is not really a choice at this point. There's also the issue of the serpent in Eden, the Zionist entity led by a genocidal war criminal. And this description, by the way, is not a partisan talking point. It is backed by a warrant of arrest issued by the International Criminal Court. Also, as I record this program, this 14-point MOU is the closest that all sides have reached to trying to somehow get that pause, get that space to start talking about other issues. How it's going to pan out, we still don't know. But I'll get to that. Now to my special guest, Dr.Trita Parsi. Anyone who's followed the events would or should know him, but I'll introduce him nonetheless. Dr. Parsi is co-founder and executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. The name is eponymous with the sixth US president, John Quincy Adams, who believed, there was a time someone believed that the US should avoid overseas military interventions. These Beltway think tanks, for the most part, are what I would describe as Teddy Roosevelt Institutes for Foreign Interventions. But back to Dr. Parsi, his trilogy on the US-Iran Zionist entity is a must-read, though I must confess that I have yet to read the second one, A Single Roll of the Dice, Obama's Diplomacy with Iran. But I believe the third one, Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy, a very comprehensive account of US-Iran diplomacy that resulted in the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, kind of covers the second book too. The first one, Treacherous Alliance, the secret dealings of Iran, Israel, and the United States. I can't remember really, but I think I came across it probably in 2013. It came out, I think, in 2007. And that's the book that got me interested in Trita Parsi's work. So welcome to the program, Trita. I've been wanting to do this for a while, and it's great to finally have you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure and a great honor.
So let me lay out what Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said to state TV, and I'll try and do it quickly. So he said that there are two stages, and in the first stage, you have formal end to the war on all fronts, including Lebanon, a commitment that neither side will initiate a new war or use threats and force, the lifting of the US naval blockade, a framework for the release of Iran's frozen assets. And then an important point, we'll get to that, the Strait of Hormuz is addressed in the MOU. And Araghchi said that Iran's future management of the waterway will be different from the past, and that services there will no longer be free. The arrangement for the 60-day period will be settled by the MOU itself, but other details may be finalized during the follow-on negotiations. Then he talked about sanctions relief and reconstruction, and as part of a reconstruction and economic development plan. And he said that full mechanisms on the matter will be agreed during later negotiation. And then comes the second stage, which would again consist of 60 days of negotiation toward the final agreement with the possibility of extension by mutual consent. And these talks will aim to resolve the nuclear file, including uranium enrichment and Iran's stockpile of 60% enriched uranium. And then these negotiations will also address the broader issues raised in the MOU, including sanctions relief, reconstruction and economic development plan, arrangements related to the Strait of Hormuz, and other technical details. And on Hormuz, Iran and Oman said, as the two sovereign states bordering the strait, will continue to oversee its security and administration. And so this is very interesting, Trita. So now, if we accept, as I said, fingers still crossed, sources here tell me that it actually fairly closely resembles the original baseline ceasefire setup before the blockade escalated things. Now that it is being signed, well, again, fingers crossed, what do you think might have changed for Trump? I mean, is he finally figuring out that he can't pick two watermelons together?
It's a great way of putting it. One difference that I think, first of all, you're right. It does very much resemble what existed before the blockade complicated matters. One difference, however, is I don't believe that back then there was a demand by the Iranians for the release of their assets in order to agree to an MOU. In fact, it wasn't an MOU at all. It was just an agreement for both sides to back off from the blockade and from the closing of the straits, and then real negotiations would begin. It was pretty straightforward. Now, because of the blockade, because of the escalation, we're seeing a much, much more complicated negotiation to get to where we almost got thanks to a couple of tweets a couple of weeks ago. So it tells you really how much this type of pipe dream that, there's going to be some sort of a game-changing escalation that will force the Iranians to the knees has actually complicated matters tremendously, because now, in order to get back to where we could have been, had Trump not rejected that, and I'll get into that in a detail, now there also has to be all of these other elements, including the release of assets, although that probably will be done through a credit line. Yeah. If just to go back to what happened back then, there was this agreement between the two sides that the Iranians would announce that they're opening the straits and the US would lift the blockade. And after that, there would be some follow-on negotiations. It wasn't structured very much in detail. Araghchi then tweets and says exactly that. But then Trump responds by saying that, the Iranians have capitulated or something like that, but I'm not going to lift the blockade. And then in an interview within the White House, forgot which room they were in, he said that all of my advisors told me to go for the deal, and I said, no, why should I lift the blockade and allow them to make money? Yeah. So he killed that opportunity. And instead, we are now here probably achieving the same thing, plus a credit line or unfreezing of assets for the Iranians.
Absolutely. So, I think, sorry, go ahead.
So I think we're seeing, and I'm sure there's been other examples in which the Iranians may have done something similar. So for instance, it does appear that at the end of the day, they're the ones who couldn't come fully to a yes in the Islamabad talks. And it would be interesting to compare once we have the details of exactly what that solution would have been compared to what we're seeing now.
Yeah, which is why I said it nearly resembles that. Obviously, as events unfolded, Iran has also kind of, ratcheted up its own set of demands. I don't think Lebanon was part of those discussions in Islamabad. But let me get to another issue, which I think is very important, because you've been arguing for some time that Iran has discarded its strategic patience in favor of doctrine of swift and, as a matter of fact, quid pro quo plus retaliation to deny Washington the ability to strike with impunity. Now, I agree with you. But do you think this new doctrine stabilizes deterrence, or does it put Tehran in a commitment trap and also compresses decision-making windows in Washington and the Zionist entity, which could potentially make future wars more likely?
I don't think that a retaliation of 1.5, as they say now, is necessarily a smart path in the long run for the Iranians to go. That would be essentially, at least that aspect of it would be similar to the Israeli security doctrine, in which they explicitly say if they are attacked, they will retaliate disproportionately. I do think that the Iranians are going to go in the direction of resurrecting what they call their forward defense, meaning that through the building up of different organizations and entities throughout the region, they use them as a forward defense to ensure that the war does not come to Iran's territory, a strategy that from their standpoint had been quite successful up until October 7th. So for instance, in 2006, Israel and Lebanon has this war. The Israelis failed to defeat Hezbollah after 34 days of warfare. And in fact, it was quite a humiliating defeat for the Israelis. But in the midst of it, I remember I was at a conference and I ran into Israel's, I think he was either their deputy defense minister at the time or their former deputy defense minister at the time. I had interviewed him a couple of times for my book. So we chatted about it and he said, look, Lebanon is just a pit stop. The real thing is to go for a war with Iran. It just requires that Lebanon and Hezbollah is first defeated. But because they couldn't defeat Hezbollah, the war never went to Iran. So Hezbollah proved its utility as a forward defense for the Iranians and prevented the war from getting to Iranian territory. You had Iranian leaders recently say that Iran is not going to go back to having its deterrence be on its own soil. Its deterrence is now going to be outside of Iran. Again, a hint at this forward defense. In the process of establishing that, perhaps the Iranians will go in the direction of the retaliation of 1.5, if they can. I'm not saying that they're going to be successful at it. But if they try to have that as some sort of a permanent defense doctrine, I think that ultimately is going to be destabilizing for the region and ultimately be bad for Iran itself.
My own sense is, and it's interesting because, I didn't use the term 1.5, which is what the Iranians have used. I instead used the term quid pro quo plus. And the reason I use that term is because that is now, since 2019, with the Indian aggression, where they tried to take out target in Balakot in Pakistan. And then we had our Operation Swift Retort and all that. So our doctrine has been quid pro quo plus. So if you fire one missile, we'll respond with 2 or 3. So I'm assuming, given how the Zionists have been operating in all these years, and specifically over the last 3 years with the Daya doctrine and the rest of it, that Iran has probably decided that perhaps a disproportionate response, which does not necessarily mean targeting civilians, which is what the Zionists do, but to try and create that kind of deterrence. Anyway, there's another issue here, which I think is important and which you've been talking about, and that has to do with U.S. military bases in the Gulf. Now, we have seen that these bases were there because the Gulfies thought that, these were deterrents, specifically against Iran. And now we've seen that, as you have mentioned actually, that they're no longer deterrents, they're rather magnets for Iranian attacks. And so that has effectively shattered the decades old American security umbrella in so many ways. And we also know that there's already conversation in the Gulf states about the necessity to diversify their security dependencies. Do you foresee a genuine regional security architecture emerging? And when I say genuine, I mean a security architecture that is inclusive of Iran rather than excluding it. Or could it trigger an arms race among Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iran?
So I would say that, first of all, I think this is one of the most important questions because it really is important for us to think about the post-American Middle East at this point. Because I don't see us going back to the old equation whatsoever. There's no chance of that at all. I think the GCC states have realized reliance on these bases is a detriment to their security. They're going to phase them out. They're not going to all get rid of them, but they're going to sail into the sunset one way or another. First questions, of course, is going to be who's going to pay for the rebuilding, because a lot of them are significantly damaged. And I don't see the GCC, who already need money for other things at this point, be willing to do so. And the US, to the best of my knowledge, have not paid for most of the bases in the region. It's the regional states that have provided the financing for it. They will continue to buy American weaponry because they're quite satisfied with their performance in many different ways. It's the bases and the American commitment to their security that they're unsatisfied with. And they will, of course, try to diversify their security basket and strike deals with Pakistan, Turkey, and other states. The question is, where will the balance be between them trying to deal with Iran's challenge to their security from their standpoint through containing Iran and through integration with Iran? I think it's quite clear that the balance in the last couple of decades clearly were overwhelmingly in favor of containment. There were some diplomatic engagement, but even if there was a desire for greater economic integration, American sanctions prevented that. MOUs were signed between Iran and the UAE. The Saudi-Iran deal was supposed to have Saudi investments in Iran that never materialized. The Saudis blame it on the sanctions. The Iranians are nevertheless upset. But bottom line is, it was 95-5 in favor of containment. And it didn't work. It not only led to war, it led to a war that Iran came out stronger from strategically and revealed the utter vulnerability of these GCC states.
Yep.
Now, can they themselves arm themselves in a way of balancing Iran? Perhaps Saudi can, but can the UAE and some of these other states whose own indigenous population are not even 1 million? Perhaps if they go nuclear, but that would be obviously a completely different scenario. Will they deepen their collaboration with Israel? Again, the UAE may go in that direction. Has that been helpful to it so far? The UAE has borne the brunt of this war precisely because it was an Israeli ally. So it didn't end up becoming a deterrent against Iran. It became an added magnet for Iranian attacks. Could they go to Pakistan and Turkey and think that Pakistan and Turkey would be willing to risk war with Iran over Qatar, Bahrain, or UAE? I can see that both Pakistan and Turkey might want to advance their positions a bit. We already saw the Saudi-Pakistani agreement. But would there be a reliable alliances in which Pakistan or Turkey would go to war with Iran? I find that unlikely. So I think the gravitational force will be in the direction of actually what you called, and I would agree with you 100%, a genuine security architecture that is fully inclusive. And that does include Iran as well. Recognizing that there is no value of any security architecture that does not include Iran, because you need to integrate with them as a security measure. And I think the mental and intellectual readiness for this, not emotional, but the intellectual readiness for this has never been greater. And it is a direct result, not just of this war, but the things that have happened in the last 5 or 6 years, starting off when the United States did not strike Iran after the Iranians struck Saudi oil fields. That's where I think a real trigger of all of this started, in which they started to really realize you cannot rely on the American security umbrella, so you have to think outside of that box. It is difficult. It's not easy. Incidentally, if I can plug something that we have done at the Quincy Institute, we had a project that was called the Better Order Project. It's still ongoing. We brought together 130 former foreign ministers, defense ministers, UN ambassadors, scholars from 40 countries. Ambassador Lodi from Pakistan was a participant, to think through major security reforms that are needed as the world transitions away from unipolarity. 20 proposals ranging from climate to UN Security Council reform to many other things, including ordering in the Middle East. And we do have 2 proposals on how to create a new security architecture in the Middle East that would be fully inclusive and ultimately would also include Israel. But on the contingency, on the ticket price for Israel to be included is that there also is a viable Palestinian state based on 1967 lines for Israel to be in it, as an incentive for the Israelis to actually give up this ruthless and counterproductive occupation that they're holding.
That's another thing that I want to talk to you about. That's not going to happen as far as I'm concerned. And I have reasons to believe. And frankly, I say this, I haven't said this during this program as yet. I always refer to them as the Zionist entity because we officially don't recognize the state. And I personally don't recognize the state. And I consider this occupied Palestine, so I never refer to it by its name. But that's a separate debate.
But let me just say one thing on that, and we don't have to debate that part of it. Just wanted to clarify one thing. Our proposal does not say that the security architecture cannot be established until Israel is in on it or has agreed to a Palestinian state. In fact, we say the opposite. We should go forward and establish a security architecture. The Israelis should see that the region moves on without them. But there should be a door open in case, perhaps extremely unlikely, as you put it out.
It's a kind of reversal of the so-called Abraham Accords.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. No, I'd love to. Has this been put out as yet?
Yeah, it is. You can go to betterorderproject.org.
Okay.
It is public there. And again, the people who wrote this and it's been circulated amongst governments, including the U.S. government, were themselves former officials with significant connections. One of them, for instance, is Nabil Fahmy, the former Egyptian foreign minister, who is now going to become the head of the Secretary General of the Arab League in a couple of weeks.
No. So the security architect, as a matter of fact, it was like a couple of months ago, I wrote a longish piece for Dawn in which I talked about the security architecture. And I was, in a way, it's akin to the point where the Europeans had to decide whether they want to have a collective European security architecture that excludes Russia or includes Russia. So, the Gulf Cooperation Council began as a containment kind of, collection against Iran. Right now, we see this fault line between the Saudis and the UAE. I also believe that Qatar, Oman, Saudi Arabia can be bracketed in a different way from Bahrain and the UAE. So I think I'm also not particularly sure about the future of the GCC, but that's another debate altogether.
Yeah, I think the GCC as an entity, I think at this point, again, this is the danger of creating some of these non-inclusive arrangements. And I'm not saying that inclusive arrangements do not suffer some risks as well, but there was a certain geopolitical circumstance that gave birth to the GCC, a sense of common threat both from Iraq and from Iran. And that balance, that geopolitical circumstance in many ways has now changed because several of these states are on the record saying Israel is a greater threat to them than what Iran is. Many of them have better relationships with Iran than they have with their GCC members. But then at the same time, they're tied into this architecture that not only responds to a potential common threat from Iran, but also seems to seek to preserve a common threat from Iran. And it's a similar situation that you had in other arrangements. I remember, for instance, talking to the former ambassador of Iran serving the Shah's government about how the Shah during the 1970s started to shift away from Israel and closer to the Arab side, particularly after his rapprochement with Egypt when Sadat took over and Sadat left the Russian or the Soviet camp. And the Israelis were very worried at the time, who of course had a relationship with Iran, a pretty deep security relationship with Iran, that they were being abandoned. And the ambassador said, look, Iran's game was to make sure that we could make peace with the Arabs from a position of strength. But we were not going to have an enmity with the Arabs permanently in order to have a friendship with Israel. And it's a very critical point here, which is that you can end up in a situation and an arrangement. You make peace with the Israelis because you have this shared threat from the Arab side, which they did. But that's a reaction to the reality. It's not an aim at preserving that reality. If they could make peace with the Arabs from a position of strength, that was better than just retaining an enmity with them in order to have the Israelis as friends. And this is the same thing that some of the GCC states are now faced with. Are they going to retain an enmity with Iran in order to keep the GCC together? Or are they going to recognize that circumstances have changed, the security needs are different, they need to make some sort of arrangement with Iran? They need to also more accurately address some of the challenges they have with some of their other GCC neighbors, instead of being pushed into an artificial architecture that was based on a reality that no longer exists.
Containing Iran, scared of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Arab Spring, losing their, these monarchies. These are, and of course, water management and high tech and the rest of it, and staying close to the United States and using the Zionists as a stepping stone towards increasing influence in DC and so on and so forth. So yeah, but a lot has changed. But one other point that I want to make before we proceed further, with reference to what you had said about Iran and Turkey, Pakistan and Turkey. Pakistan has the largest Shia population outside of Iran. And the Shia population in Pakistan has been upwardly mobile. Most of them are highly educated. They have held very senior positions in the military and civil services and academia. They have had very important positions politically. The man who founded Pakistan was a Shia. And we have a national anthem which is entirely in Persian. So, and the court language in the subcontinent before the British came was Persian. I mean, the elite used Persian. And it's almost like akin to the kind of influence that French had in Europe, with from Peter the Great's court right up to the English court, every court speaking French. So yeah, no, we are in no position, even if one were to talk about self-interest, to go for a policy that pits us against Iran. Although Pakistan and Iran relations have had their highs and lows. I think Watan Khan wrote a good book on that, Alex. So, but one other important
could I, if it's permitted, I love these podcasts because you can have a conversation and not just an interview. Could I ask you, tell me what you think Pakistan's calculation is here in terms of how deep does it want to be included in a security architecture for the Middle East? By and large, Pakistan has oftentimes, at least by the Middle Eastern countries, not been seen as part of the Middle East. But now, for a variety of reasons, deliberately or undeliberately, it appears to have entered into it. Is this a complete shift? How far is Pakistan inclined to go? How does it play with, I assume that it is, obviously, this is a calculation that is coming also together with its own rivalry with India. I would be very eager to hear your thoughts on particularly how far the Pakistani ambition in all of this is.
Well, so the first thing, historically speaking, Pakistan is not a new entrant in the Middle East arena. As a matter of fact, we were really active in the Middle East, and this goes in a way before the advent of Pakistan itself, like the All India Muslim League. In the early 20th century, had these resolutions opposing the Balfour Declaration and the sole idea of having a state for the Jews in Palestine. And after Pakistan was formed, our then foreign minister, Sir Zafrullah Khan, and this is a matter of record, was deeply opposed to the resolution that created the Zionist entity. And then Pakistan actually helped Iraq and Syria in the 67 and Syria in the 73 war. I mean, there were some Pakistani fighter pilots who were flying Syrian fighter aircraft. In fact, the only recorded kill by a Syrian aircraft was actually being flown by a Pakistani fighter pilot. So, and then Pakistan was always, into this whole idea of how to resolve this Palestinian issue. We finally went for the 2002 Arab Initiative, the Saudi Initiative, which talked about the state solution and so on and so forth. And frankly, personally, I don't believe in the two-state solution at all. But that's a separate debate. So Pakistan is not a new entrant. But another important issue is that when Saudi Arabia wanted us to be part of the Yemen offensive, the then Prime Minister actually did something very clever. He told the Saudis, he said, listen, I have to place this before the parliament. And the parliament issued a resolution against being part of that campaign. Partly because we did not want to go against Ansar Allah, which was obviously linked with Iran. So we have always had, it's like real tightrope walking because of historical cultural ties with Iran, because of the majority Sunni faith ties with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. We have been providing security to the House of Saud for more than 5 decades. So it's always been, which is why Pakistan wants to have some kind of arrangement. And this is what Pakistan has said to the Iranians, to the Saudis, and to the Chinese also, that we want an arrangement which somehow resolves the issue between the east and west of the Gulf. So it is in Pakistan's interest to have some kind of arrangement between Saudi Arabia, just to use Saudi Arabia as the broader metaphor for the Gulf, and Iran.
But would Pakistan be willing to step in as a security guarantor for more than just Saudi Arabia? I mean, Pakistan cannot replace the United States, even though, of course, the US's commitments proved to be much more flimsy than the GCC states had expected. But it would also be challenging, perhaps, because it could very well then lead back to some sort of arrangement that is not based on trying to create a collective security mindframe, but rather just simply balancing.
So let me put on my IR hat here. I mean, so Pakistan cannot really be a security guarantor. I mean, if you look at alliances which have a heavy component of security, you got to have a clearly predominant state, which is predominant in terms of its internal politics, stability, economic prowess, military prowess. NATO is one example. Warsaw Pact was another example. if you go back to the Peloponnesian Wars, you've got the Sparta and Athens. So you got to have, and right now in the Muslim world, or should I say the Muslim majority world, there is no single state which fulfills that requirement. I mean, states have, like Saudis have tons of money, of course, but they don't, I mean, they spend a lot on their defense, but they really don't have a military to write home about. Turkey is in many ways very strong. In other ways, its internal politics is unstable. It's the same with Pakistan. We economically we basically under the IMF program, our internal politics is pretty unstable, but militarily in many ways we're very strong, and so I think you got to have some kind of arrangement where where these states come together and create a synergy where each brings to the table its strong point, which is then offset by the strong point of another state. Whether that can happen is something, of course, that is anybody's guess. But I think the idea of middle powers and multipolarity, and the idea of avoiding destruction and bloodshed within the region are likely to force these states to try and somehow be a little more innovative in terms of their approaches and somehow come up with some kind of arrangement. But one thing that I've personally been warning against is this whole idea of a Sunni collective security, because that's like a red rag to the bull.
Yeah.
And so that is something which needs to be avoided very consciously.
Yeah, absolutely.
But anyway,
and I think,
it's not about my this program is not about me, this is about you. So let's get back to some questions, and one of which I've earlier talked to you about that also, and you've been talking about it, you've written about this also. This willingness by Iran to directly strike Israel over regional actions. So at least in theory, it's begun to check Israeli impunity, and kind of also driven a strategic wedge in this particular case, between Trump and Netanyahu. So one question is, how significant do you think this is? Second, allied one, that we also have a bill, the US-Israel Defense Technology Cooperation Initiative, which I believe is, let me see, I pulled it up. Yeah, Section 224. And it is embedded in the House Armed Services Committee's draft of the fiscal year 2027, which is the NDAA. Of course, it has to go through the House vote and Senate action and reconciliation, etc. But it seems it will sail through. And if that happens, that would further integrate the two militaries. So my question is, how far do you think Iran could be successful in creating that kind of triangular coercion? And how far can there be a wedge between the Zionist entity and the US if this bill does sail through?
So on the first part, this is an effort by the Iranians to establish that extended deterrence.
Correct.
And what we have seen, and this is what the Israelis then call a new equation in the region, essentially saying that if Israel strikes at Lebanon, Iran will strike at Israel. And it is quite unprecedented, because we have not seen for a very long time that either an external player or an internal player in the region would be willing to back up its warnings and its efforts to limit Israel's aggression, maneuverability, whatever you want to call it, with hard power. It's been decades since that happened. Now, of course, Ansarullah has attacked Israel several times, but is incomparable to what Iran can do with 200-300 missiles shooting at Israel at once. Now, Whether that succeeds or not remains to be seen. I don't think there's anyone on either side, in Israel or in Iran, that have an expectation that one round of exchanges will establish that new equation. It will take
Correct.
several different rounds. But what we can say has happened in the first round is this. The Israelis ignored the Iranian warning. They perhaps thought it was a bluff. Perhaps they thought it would be good if the Iranians attacked Israel because it could kill the diplomacy and force Trump back into the war. But the Iranians retaliated. They struck at Israel. Trump told them not to strike back, but the Israelis nevertheless did. But it appears to have been more performative than substantive. The Iranians then struck Israel again, and that one was smaller than the first attack. The Israelis did not strike at Iran again. Instead, they struck at southern Lebanon, not Beirut. Until this day, they have not struck Beirut yet. So at a minimum, at first, it does appear that a red line around Beirut may have at least had some success. But it's very difficult to say that this has really succeeded unless there is a couple of more exchanges, most likely. And whether it will succeed or not remains a question mark. But it creates a challenge for the Israelis. First of all, I think it's important to also recognize that deterrence is not 100%. It does not mean that the Israelis will not strike Lebanon or Beirut. It just means that every time they consider doing so, they now have to take into account the risk that there will be an additional cost because the Iranians may strike at them in a manner that did not exist before, because they essentially had total maneuverability in the region, total dominance, and this has been US policy to provide them with that dominance. This is the first time that there's a real challenge, in a long time at least, a real challenge to that. And whether it succeeds or not remains to be seen. But the risk for the Israelis, if they test this, after there's been an MOU, and the MOU has been seen as successful and part of Trump's legacy, is that they then will not just be trying to restart a war with Iran, they're also trying to undo the agreement between the US and Iran, which can be seen by the US as a direct threat. It appears that in this time around, the US either did not at all provide any defensive support for Israel or provided less of it than it did in previous wars. In the previous war, I mean, the one just ending recently, the US actually expended more interceptors defending Israel than Israel expended interceptors defending Israel. The US did more to defend Israel than Israel did to defend itself.
Absolutely.
I suspect, because at first the US came out and said that they actually did not participate in the shooting down of the missiles, but later on said that they did. I suspect that it is less than it was before, and I suspect that that was a deliberate message to the Israelis, that you continue this, you will be on your own. In fact, Trump said that. He said those exact words to Netanyahu.
Yeah.
And the US absolutely can. There's nothing that forces the US to participate in this. And if Israel then ends up in a direct confrontation with Iran without American involvement in the war, offensively or defensively, that is a completely different proposition. Something that is much, much more difficult for the Israelis to handle. I mean, the Israelis had help from France, Italy, the UK, several other NATO countries in shooting down Iranian missiles in every one of the wars so far. The Germans were extremely active in between the first and the second war, the June war and the February war, to improve Israel's defense capabilities and their ability to shoot down Iranian missiles. They had German engineers, etc., deeply involved in that. So you take all of this out, and the Israelis are completely on their own. I'm not saying that they're incapable in any way, shape, or form, but this is a highly inflated wannabe hegemon. It does not have the ability to be a hegemon. It only has the ability to be the tip of the spear of someone else's hegemony. And that hegemon, the United States, is no longer that interested in having hegemony in the Middle East because it's not worth it. The American people do not want it. They want to bring the soldiers home. They're unhappy with Trump for having started this war. He promised he would not start more wars in general, and certainly no more wars in the Middle East. I mean,
Absolutely.
In Syria, Trump famously said, this sand is not worth fighting for, when he was pushed into going into Syria. And he's backtracked on all of that, and that's an entire different show in which we have to better understand why he did so. But nevertheless, the American public has not changed their minds. Their minds are absolutely still very much with the fact that the US should get out of the Middle East and this hegemony is simply not worth it because this region is no longer that strategically important.
No, absolutely. No, I completely agree with you. I think it's been at least 2 years when there was a conference in which I said, listen, if the Zionists were not being replenished by everyone and Charlie's aunt, they would not be able to sustain this war for even 3 months. I mean, this is a basic, anyone who understands military operations understands this. So you're absolutely right. But before I close, I want to, because this is something that normally doesn't come up in interviews because there's the immediacy of the situation and, the questions are focused on that. But I want to dwell on 2 points that come out of your book length works. One of which is that diplomacy does work when it is allowed to work, as in diplomacy with Iran. So JCPOA being one example, and you were part of that process in some ways. And secondly, that Western reports and analyses spend a lot of time talking about Iran's system of government as ideological, as theocratic, willing or unwillingly ignoring the pragmatism that informs Iran's approaches. I mean, look at the Bonn process for it. I mean, Jawad Zarif and James Dobbins were having coffee together. Zarif was telling him that, we're going to help you with the constitution. And they, as a matter of fact, Dobbins has written about this. And then there was this whole idea of the 2003 grand bargain. And then, of course, Bush being Bush, that axis of evil speech. And then everything fell apart. So I mean, I just want you to dwell on that because, as I said, book length works. I mean, you have gone in those 3 books, the middle one that I still have to read. You've gone and you've talked to literally hundreds of people, actors involved in those processes.
So, first of all, I think this is a very good question for people to revisit at this point, because we have to rethink, at least on the Western side, a lot of these images and beliefs that we have been fed about what Iran is and what Iran isn't. This idea of it is just being an ideological, suicidal, irrational actor is an image that was pushed for by the Israelis and the neocons because it served a very important purpose. If the other side is ideological, if it is irrational, and if it is also suicidal, it means diplomacy can't work. But it also
you throw
means
out
that,
your hand. What can we do?
Exactly. Yeah. Deterrence can also not work because if they're not rational and on top of that they're suicidal, it means they will attack you. So it's an image that was created in order to push the United States towards preventive war. Meaning, if you wanted to make sure that the US had to start the war, even when there wasn't a threat, essentially a war of choice, you had to put forward that image. And this was done during the Bush years. What is fascinating, and part of the reason why the neocons hate me so much and have done so much to attack and slander me, is because it was oftentimes the very same neocons, the very same individuals who in the 1980s in the United States were pushing the United States publicly and inside of government to talk to the Iranians and to sell them weapons, because at the time that was good for Israel. At the time, the Israelis were very adamant about seeing whether their alliance with Iran that existed during the time of the Shah could have been resurrected, even with the Islamic Republic, because the geopolitical circumstances in their view was such that Iran still needed Israel's help against Iraq. And it still had a common geopolitical, common threats in the region. And as a result, those forces should have pushed Iran in the direction of Israel. And in some ways it did, because the Iranians did deal with Israel in the 1980s behind the scenes, but publicly they took on a different position. Those same individuals who were pushing and saying that the Iranians, even under Ayatollah Khomeini, are not ideological, you should talk to them, you should even sell them weapons, 15 years later, are in Washington saying these guys are irrational, ideological, and suicidal. There's no other option but to actually go into a preventive war with them and bomb them.
Yeah.
And what I did in these books is just go through what the history actually has been and what the calculations of the Iranians have been in a lot of these different key moments. And that's why I relied on interviews rather than going into what was written in secondary documents, because I wanted to actually really press them. What was the strategic calculation behind statements, decisions, et cetera, that they made? And you see a very clear picture of a very rational, cost-benefit calculating approach that at the same time, from their view, needed to be covered in Islamic language, because the Iranian ambition under the Islamic Republic was to become a leader in the Islamic world. And as a result, it could not justify its decisions simply through a nationalist language, but needed to couch it in a more ideological Islamic language in order for it to be attractive to the broader Islamic world. The Shah had the same ambitions of being a major power, but he identified Iran as a major power in West Asia. It was geographic, whereas Khomeini identified it as ideological. It was Islamic. But at the core of it, you could clearly see that they were still making very, very clear geopolitical calculations in which ideology was used primarily to justify the decisions rather than to drive the decisions. And what was also very clear is that in my conversations with the Israelis, and they were particularly valuable because I did my interviews with the Israelis, but then oftentimes they kept me in their office for another 30 minutes or 60 minutes in which they interviewed me, because I had already interviewed a lot of Iranian officials. And those interviews by them were particularly useful because government officials are always trained to give answers that kind of cover up what your real motive or your real reasons are. But when you ask questions, you reveal what you're really looking for. And in many of those questions, the basis, the premise of their questions was very clearly that the Iranians were rational actors that acted according to a specific doctrine and logic. Ideology was there, but was not the driving force of matters. So both sides knew this, but both sides had an interest in portraying things as more ideological. The Iranians, because they wanted to become a leader in the Islamic world under the Islamic Republic, and the Israelis because they wanted to portray them as irrational, ideological, hateful, etc., in order to get the United States to attack them.
Yeah, so one final question. Actually, this is a question on which one could, go on for an hour, couple of hours maybe. But this is an important question in terms of some kind of post-war scenario. And when I say post-war scenario, I'm talking about some kind of resolution between Iran and the US. But my position is that in this bad marriage, there is a third party. And that third party, the Zionist entity, has undergone its own societal changes, its own political changes over the last 20 years, I would say. Or should I say, since the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, who incidentally was not someone who wanted a sovereign Palestinian state. 29 days before he was killed, he made a speech at the Knesset, which is available for anyone to read, where he said that this is an administrative measure, it's not about a sovereign Palestinian state. Netanyahu comes along through the Abraham Accords, you present the Palestinians, you think you have finally solved the issue. So structurally speaking, and as a structural realist, I do believe that structural analysis is extremely important. Iran and the Zionist entity are now at a stage which actually reminds me of Hegel's self-consciousnesses fighting a mortal combat. It's an existential. As a matter of fact, it's interesting and a bit ironic also that in so many ways, the Zionist entity and Iran at this point are kind of similar. And so my question to you, and I know I'm being, this is not this is unjust to ask you to try and answer this question quickly or briefly, but do you think, given this, there is actually a resolution between Iran and the Zionist entity?
I do think that ultimately, I'm not talking about a friendship or alliance or anything of that kind. But I think that there are ways of pacifying this. Because one thing that you mentioned earlier on is really a critical element of this. And that is that for some reason, this bad marriage between the US and Iran has permitted a third actor to be in it. It is a decision, or at least an acceptance of it being in it. For the US and Iran to resolve their tensions, they have to make a decision to do a deal between themselves and not bring the Israelis into it, or at least not give them a veto over it. This is what Obama ended up having to do, and this is what Trump is going to end up having to do. This is what Biden chose not to do, incidentally. He constantly was trying to make sure that the Israelis would be okay with whatever deal he would strike with Iran in terms of going back to the JCPOA. And that's the key reason why that didn't happen. There were a lot of problems on the Iranian side afterwards once Raisi became president. But at the outset, the biggest blunder was that Biden, who prided himself of being a Zionist and who proved it later on by supporting a genocide on behalf of the Israelis, wanted to make sure that he could strike a deal that the Israelis would be happy with. And that's a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation, because there would be no deal that the Israelis would be happy with. They would oppose any deal, because the very issue is not the content of the deal, it's that a deal would mean that the US and Iran would move in the direction of reducing their tensions. The Israelis asked themselves the question, a very important question. If the US and Iran improve their relations or reduce their tensions, will there be a proportionate reduction in Israeli-Iranian tensions? And they believe that there will not be. And I think they may be wrong, but nevertheless. And that means then that they feel that they will then be abandoned by the United States, because the United States has global responsibility. It will move on from the Middle East, and Israel will face Iran alone. So they will be opposed to any deals. So, but if the US and Iran decide that this is their marriage, they're going to have to deal with it. No third party is going to have a veto over it. And they actually managed to get to a deal, and they managed to make it insulated enough so that sabotage efforts by the Israelis are unsuccessful. They succeeded in pushing Trump to sabotage the deal that Obama had done, of course. Then I think you may end up in a new scenario in which the Israelis once again will have to face a reality which is that without the US's support, they cannot pursue regional dominance and total maneuverability. And they're going to have to adopt a different measure. It is not going to be a friendship between Iran and Israel, but it's going to be one in which these type of measures, like relying on the US military, no longer will be available to the Israelis. And they're going to have to rethink all of their moves, because they're going to have to act on their own without that type of a massive superpower putting its finger on the scale in its favor. That is going to be gone. And in that scenario, I think they're going to have to rethink how they approach matters. And if they do rethink it, I think there is an opportunity for some sort of modus vivendi. I'm not saying that there doesn't need to be a rethinking on the Iranian side. It will be as well. But one of the things that oftentimes is misunderstood in all of this, and again, it goes back to how the neocons have presented this situation, is that the real core of the problem is Iran's ideology. And as I explained already, I don't think that is the case. I think Iran's ideology is a problem. It's not the core problem. I think there's going to have to be some measures there. But a core problem that is not being addressed is the fact that the Israelis believe that the only way for them to be safe and secure is for everyone else to be insecure. Israel should have deterrence against everyone. No one should be able to deter Israel. That is essentially military hegemony that they're looking for. And as long as they're looking for that, they will always be at tensions with Iran, regardless of which government is in power there, and regardless of which ideology or no ideology that it upholds. Because a country the size of Iran will never accept to be under the military dominance of a small state like Israel, particularly not a large country like Iran that has a history of being a regional superpower and has as part of its identity the belief, right or wrong, that it is its natural role in the region to be a regional dominant power. Such a country will never accept being under Israeli dominance. And this is one of those things that I think is completely misunderstood. And of course, you have these Iranian monarchists that are now completely surrendered to the Israelis. And I think the Shah himself would be utterly ashamed of seeing what his son and his son's supporters have turned into.
Absolutely. No, I mean, this is an issue on which I have my very strong views. And I must say that while this is without prejudice to what you've said, but I think structurally it's not going to happen. And, frankly, since I use the marriage metaphor for US-Iran relations, right now it reminds me of Albies Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf with Martha and George in such an abusive marriage that they cannot even have conjugal, association without abusing each other. So let's see how that pans out in this particular case. But Dr. Trita Parsi, thank you so much for being on the program. Really
My
appreciate
pleasure.
it. And I hope that we will have other opportunities to discuss a lot that has remained undiscussed, shall I say, or less discussed than I would have wanted it to be discussed. But I'm really grateful.
Thank you so much. Pleasure was all mine.
This is all from us. And just stay safe. Give us your comments because your comments help us improve the program. Until next time, stay safe and goodbye.